I'm going to show you how to shade a cube using the 5 key components of shading. First, let's set up our value scale. You're going to do full pressure in box 5 to get your darkest value from your graphite pencil. I'm using an H because that's a good starting point for our shading. If you're going to take one pencil to a deserted island, it would probably be an HB because it's halfway between hard and black or soft. But I've got an H just in my hand right now. I'm just going to hold my pencil pretty far back on the H in order to get a light pressure, as light as I can, to get my 25% gray. Then you're going to go over boxes 3 and 4. Try to keep your strokes so close together that it becomes a continuous shaded mass where you can't differentiate the different strokes, so it looks like a continuous gradient. Okay, and then I'm going to push a little bit harder and get my 50% gray value, and then over box 4 as well. And then push even a little bit harder and get your 75% gray. Then when you're done, you could look over it and modify the values in order to have consistent jumps in value. Okay, so I feel like that's not bad. If you went too far, you can always use your kneaded rubber and just bop it a little bit, lighten up the value without erasing everything in there. I feel like that was a little bit better. If you want to fine tune it, we can go to a harder pencil as well. I mean, make my 75 a little bit darker, make my 50% gray a little bit more consistent. Okay, so now we have our baseline for our values. Now we're going to do our cube. Okay, first we have to draw our cube. So remember, the cube is, what do we know about cubes? All of the edges are the same length in actual life. However, in linear perspective, when we see the cube in perspective, parts of it kind of look smaller because it's getting farther away from us, and the parts that are bigger are closer are bigger. Okay, so it does change a little bit, but we do know that all the sides are supposed to be the same length, and so we have 3 sets of parallel and almost same length lines. Okay, so that's what we're going to go with. So we'll just do the vertical lines first. You're going to draw the closest edge to us. Okay, and then I see the edge on the left side here, so this is the middle edge here, and then we're going to draw the one that's to the left, and that one's pretty close to it and a little bit higher, right? It's a little bit higher. And then the one on the right is actually kind of twice the distance away as the one on the left, so we're just going to use our knowledge of relationships here and draw it a little bit farther away. Make sure that it's about the same length, so I can use my pencil and kind of gauge the length of objects. And then we're going to connect these edges using lines using the same angles that we see in the image. So I see this angle here, and remember, these lines are supposed to be parallel and the same length. Okay, so you want to make sure that your angles are consistent. So I'm going to put my pencil up to this and look at that angle, compare it to this one. It's the same. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same angles for the top of the sides on the left. Make sure that they're consistent. Make sure that they're the same angle. You can put your pencil up to it and kind of roughly measure the angle, compare the angles, make sure they're the same. And there are 3 sets of parallel, almost same length lines. We've done one set here, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to do another set here. This is 1, 2, and then this angle in the back should be parallel, and almost the same length. Could be a bit shorter because it's a little farther away in perspective. And then we're going to do this last set of lines. So we have this angle, should be about the same length and same angle as this one, and the third one. So we're going to close off this box and do the third one. Okay. So remember, a cube has 3 sets of almost parallel, almost same length lines, and you want to make sure that you do that when you're drawing a cube. Okay, and I don't know if I said this, but I'm using an H pencil, a nice medium hardness pencil. I think HB is absolutely in the center, just like 0, the origin on a number line. I'm using H, a little bit on the harder side, which is great for preliminary marks. Okay, any kind of H pencil, H, 2H, 4H, 6H is great for preliminary marks, as long as you don't push too hard. I'm going to start shading with it. As you can see in the image on the left, we've got certain areas that we want to target with our shading. Especially, we'll start with the darker areas because it's easy to go darker. It's hard to go lighter. So we're going to err on the side of caution and just start shading with the darker areas. So I'm just going to go with this darkest face, and it's supposed to be a 3 value at the top. So notice the stroke direction I'm using. I'm actually mimicking the angle of the sides of this, and that's going to emphasize the flatness of this side of the cube. I'm just going to give it a general shading all the way down. It does lighten in the bottom left corner. There's a bit of reflected light coming up in this bottom left corner, so you want to make sure you don't get too dark there. It's supposed to be kind of fading to a 2 in that corner, so I'll make sure that I preserve that as I'm shading. And then I'm going to go for another round of shading. Remember, we're doing continuous values. If you need to, hold your pencil pretty far back. If your pencil's too short, get a longer pencil so that you can do this. Hold it pretty far back so you can have more control. Now, if you find that you're getting too dark too quickly with your H, you can get an even harder pencil. You can go to 2H, 4H. Okay, whatever suits your needs. So now I'm going to get this core of the shadow in this bottom corner here. You can see this kind of like triangle of darker shading, and this is actually the area of the cast shadow that's kind of reflected, or rather not reflected, onto the object. The shadow is kind of like being reflected onto the object in that there's no light that's allowed to bounce out back in that area because the core of the shadow has, or the cast shadow has prevented that from bouncing back onto the object. So now I'm going to go around and make sure I have the right values. Remember, we did this value scale for a reason. This is supposed to be 3 up here. This is supposed to be 4. And I'm going to compare with the value scale that I made over here just to make sure I'm consistent. And then I'm going to get this edge. I'm going to define this edge just very slightly, very subtly. It's good to subtly define edges. We don't want a cartoony dark line, but defining the edges subtly actually helps with the clarity of the object, so it's good to do that. Nice subtle edge, while still staying mostly like implied line. A nice subtle definition, it really helps the object to stand out and be sharp. Okay, so I'm going to bring this to a level 3 up top. I'm still using my H pencil. Maybe I'll switch down to like a 2H or a 4H to get more subtle changes in value. But right now I'm still using my H. Okay, so this edge I want to make sure that it's slightly defined so you can see that edge sharply like you see in the image there. Same with the top edge. Okay, make sure you can see that this light is bouncing up from the bottom left corner a little bit. Notice that I am overlapping my layers of shading. This is important in order to get gradual changes in value. If your changes in value are too abrupt, then you need to space while you're zigzagging your pencil, you want to make sure that you have more minute changes in movement so that it's nice and smooth. Okay. All right. So I've got that taken care of. Now I'm going to move on to the trickier areas, which are the lighter areas. You can see that we've got a white of the paper down here in that 1 in this very bottom corner here. But above that, it goes to 1.5, so it's not even to a 2, so it's really, really subtle. Now right now I'm going to lighten up my contour lines so that they can just disappear when I shade in the drawing. Okay. So now I'm going to kind of mimic the angle of the edges because I feel like that it's going to emphasize the different direction of the sides. So I'm really subtly using a 4H actually. So I grabbed a 4H. Maybe I'll even go to 6H because I really want this to be light. So I've grabbed my 6H. Yeah, that's much better. I'm holding my 6H really far back. So it's just the gentlest of shading here, really gentle shading. So you might feel like you want to smudge right now. That's not a good idea. Smudging actually just kind of covers over poor technique. So you can get all the values that you need without smudging as long as you have good technique. So this is good practice for having solid technique, is if you force yourself not to smudge. I know it's very tempting sometimes, but try not to smudge because it's good training. Okay, so now I'm going to change the direction for the top. I'm just going to follow the same edge as I did on the first part. And you can see how if we change the stroke direction, it actually does get that feeling of a different facet or face on the cube. So I think that's good. That's a good look. Okay, we got that 1.5 value on all the sides. Notice that this edge is a little bit defined because we do want to make sure that people know that this is a separate face than this one. That's good. Okay, so we got the 1.5, we got the 1 at the bottom. If you overdid it with any of your shading, you can always clean it up with your kneaded rubber eraser a little bit like this. Just tap to lighten it. If you got too dark in this reflected light area, you can squeeze the tip of the kneaded rubber so it's a nice sharp corner, and then you can target that area if you need to. I didn't need to, but I did that just to demonstrate. And then I'm going to restore that value there. You can always layer over softer lead with harder lead. It actually helps to smooth the texture because you know that harder leads kind of push into the pores of the paper more, and it helps to smooth the texture of the shading. So you can always layer harder lead over softer lead. Okay, now let's deal with the cast shadow. So I'm going to take my H pencil because it's right in between. I'm actually going to draw the contour for the cast shadow. It kind of is this pentagon shape. Pentagonal shape. It goes out like this, comes out like this. Okay, and now that I have the cast shadow kind of outlined, then I'm going to color it in. It's supposed to be 4 to 5 value. So usually when an object meets the ground, it actually has a defined line there because it's just making an absolute shadow right where it meets the ground. So I'm just going to get that defined line where the object meets the ground. And on this side, I just kind of do this buffer area so that when I color it in, it doesn't go into my object. So I'm kind of protecting my object a little bit there. All right, now let's shade in the cast shadow. I like to use a strictly horizontal line for the ground because I feel like that communicates that it's flat ground. Some people follow the direction of the shadow. You can do that too. And I feel like this H is not getting dark enough, so I'm going to switch to a 2B, softer pencil, and do that. And this pencil, it does have like a more rounded tip on it, so automatically I'm getting a little fuzziness, which is kind of nice around the edges. Sometimes it's not always best to use a sharp pencil when you're shading, because sometimes you do want that fuzzy line that you get from a rounded tip, so that's something to think about too, how sharp your pencil is. Otherwise, you can use the circular shading technique to get that blurry edge like I showed you in the last video. Or you can just have a blunt pencil because they really have a soft, it creates a softer line if you have a blunter pencil. So it's another tip for you. All right, here, I'll make sure my values are correct. I want to make sure that this is dark enough. In this case, I want a sharp pencil right now. I'm not sharpening it. Okay, so now we have our highlights, we have our midtones, we have our shadows, core of the shadow on the object, and then the cast shadow. I feel like this core of the shadow on the object is not quite dark enough, so I'm going to go over it a little bit more with my softer pencil, my 2B, just to get it to that level 4 value. Right there. Okay, I think that's a little better. All right, and now I've got this reflected light here. I feel like this line is too defined here. It's not light enough, so I'm going to lighten that up. And then we need a background. Now I can say you could always play with the background. You see how in this image, the background, I think the line between the ground and the background is kind of like above the object, but I'm just going to pick it like this. Like you are the artist, you're in control of your image. You can do whatever you want with the background pretty much. So I'm just going to play with it. Don't be a slave to the photograph. I know it's hard. You just kind of want to do what the photo tells you to do, but you can make it better. You can make this even better than it appears in the photo. Okay, so like I said in the last video, for the background, we want a contrasting background, but you want to make sure that you stay consistent with the direction of your stroke for the background. Otherwise, it gets really, it'll get distracting looking. You'll have less unity in your piece unless you have a consistent stroke direction from your background. If you want to do two different directions, that's fine. Just overlap them and overlay them. So if I do like a horizontal direction for one layer and then the next layer I can do a diagonal, as long as you're consistent overall. Okay, so you can see how I'm changing the direction of my stroke just for the edge because I want to make sure the edge is nice and neat, and then I'll go back to the original stroke direction. Okay, now you can see this edge. We want implied line, which means that you don't want to do a cartoony edge, but a slight, very subtle, very subtly defined edge is really nice on a piece. Otherwise, the edges will look a little too blurry. But just to guide the eye, you just do a subtle little defined line. Very subtle though. Subtly defined line goes a long way without being cartoony. Okay, just like I did there, just on the edge of the box there. Okay, for the ground, I'm going to switch to an H just to make sure I don't get too dark. Actually, I'm going to go to 4H. Let's just be safe. I'm going to do a really light value on the ground, just so it has a little contrast with the edge of the box. Otherwise, it'll get kind of lost in there. Okay, and then I noticed that right on this edge here, it gets really bright on the ground, so I'm going to avoid that area there and just shade around. Somehow the light's really picking up and bouncing right here, so I make sure I get that nice and light there. Again, we don't need to be a slave to the photograph, but I think we want to represent how light interacts with the objects of surfaces realistically as well. Okay, and then I've got just a really subtly define that edge, very, very subtly. Here, I think I made the difference here a little bit. I'm going to lighten that up over here, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so we've got our shaded cube. Now I'm going to label the 5 key components of shading. We've got our highlights that are the lightest parts where light is hitting directly on our object. We have highlights, and then we have shadows, shadows on the object. Here's the core of the shadow on the object, and then also the cast shadow cast by the object. So we've got shadows, both the core of the shadow on the object and the cast shadow on the ground. And then you have your midtones, which are all the values in between your highlights and your shadows. So we have midtones here and on both these faces. So we have midtones in a lot of places. So we have our in-between values are all our midtones. Okay, this is getting a little crowded here, but here we have our reflected light. That's super important to remember, reflected light. Actually, we have it in 2 places. We have reflected light in this corner of this face, and also here, reflected off of the ground, really bright reflection, reflected light. And actually, that's also our highlight, is the reflected light. Highlights, reflected light can be as bright as highlights, and also can be midtones. They can span a whole range of values, but but it's important to remember that by itself, reflected light has to be in an image in order for it to look realistic. And then we also have, let's see, we've got highlights, midtones, shadows, reflected light, and the last thing to remember that you must have is a contrasting background. BKGD, okay, and also to some extent the ground itself. So the background would include the ground. Okay, background includes also to some extent the ground. So you want the ground to contrast with the object as well. So that's how you shade a cube.